Alright, let's get into this. Now, as you may have heard, there's been a channel called The Hated One promoting the idea that Kurzgesagt is cooking propaganda. My perception on The Hated One's video is that it's very shallow in its criticisms against Kurzgesagt. Now, Kurzgesagt's channel's founder has put out a response to Hated One's video. It can be summed up by one of their last statements. The problem with this sort of discourse on YouTube is that it's an absolute good versus evil, and there is no space for constructive discussion. Kurzgesagt should have been more transparent turns into Kurzgesagt is literally bought by billionaires. So what I want to do with this video is split it into two sections, each dealing with a style of critique against Kurzgesagt, a critique of transparency and a critique of content. Let us start off with the content side of this, as it brings us right to the beginning of Hated One's video.
In November 2016, Kurzgesagt published a video on the most gruesome parasites. It tells a story of devastating diseases that the world governments couldn't solve, so the big pharma stepped in to be the hero of humanity and save the day. It's one of those too good to be true stories, so
note, one large problem that I saw from Hated One's video is him actually showing very little of Kurzgesagt's actual videos, which has an issue for context to his audience, which is good for transparency's sake. And if there's a actual issue or discrepancy between what you say and what the video says, that opens you up to an easy critique. I'm not just saying that Hated One got this bit wrong, as Kurzgesagt does portray them in a positive light. However, the next bits from the Hated One don't really correspond with what Kurzgesagt is saying in their video.
Pharmaceutical corporations did donate their medicine to the most affected regions, but they didn't do it out of their own volition or initiative. They did it after decades of neglecting the diseases because they weren't profitable enough to manufacture fixes for them.
However, it feels like Hated One is overpinning the blame of all of these diseases being neglected because of pharma not taking any action. Until very recently, they have all, to a greater or lesser extent, been neglected by funders, researchers, and policymakers. In September 2000, for example, the international community, through the United Nations, had placed heavy focus to combat AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. However, as a consequence, attention to many other important causes of mortality and morbidity amongst poor populations, which has already been inadequate, have declined further. However, I didn't pull this out of nowhere. This is from Hated One's own citations. His citations blame the fault of neglecting diseases to everyone. As an additional source, the WHO also points out in their first report that neglected tropical diseases have traditionally ranked low on the national and international health agendas. So it feels a bit weird to fault pharma for this. Now, there are things to fault pharma for, definitely, but I don't see this one as being it. Hated One, however, is going to transfer a lot of this blame from big pharma to blaming Bill Gates.
Bill Gates is actually responsible for much of the neglect. His charitable priorities overemphasized big-name diseases such as malaria, HIV, or tuberculosis. But in the process of doing so, they drew crucial attention and resources away from more common and structural problems, many of which
we've already been over this. Blaming Bill Gates for this, when this was the policy of the United Nations, seems a bit unfair. Now, of course, like before, are there good criticisms against Bill Gates? Of course. Is this one? No. Nearing the end of what best can be considered the pharma section of Hated One's video, it starts to become more disconnected in its criticisms, as they fail to have any actual connection to anything said by Kurzgesagt.
The pharmaceutical conglomerates never assumed any risk. These corporations took home almost $9 trillion in profits in 18 years, so this little stunt is really just a pocket change for them.
This isn't a good criticism. Whether someone has donated money to a charity or given it substantial help, risks should only matter if you're judging whether their actions were financially sound, not whether these actions are morally good. This is what I mean by disconnected. One of Kurzgesagt's major points in their video was that the pharma industry had a major impact in fighting these diseases.
Governments and health organizations just couldn't do that by themselves. Here, humanity got an opportunity to show off what the industrialized production of medicine can achieve. The pharma industry stepped in to distribute the necessary drugs for free.
However, we don't have him ever criticizing if Kurzgesagt was wrong about this point. Instead, we have him criticizing pharma for not taking actions that had financial risk. Hated One will go on and discuss that Bill Gates had stakes in many of these companies that he's been giving donations to.
And it so happens that the Gates are heavily invested in many of the pharma companies Kurzgesagt portrays as heroes. They own major holdings in many of the participating companies, and both Bill and Melinda Gates are trustees of two pharma firms. This video isn't positive news, it's a positive PR.
And we're veering off again. That's more of an issue with taxes. We should be focused on Kurzgesagt's main point. Did the pharma industry have a major impact in fighting the neglected diseases? And we get no answer from the hated one on that issue. It should also be said that Kurzgesagt never actually points out to a single pharmaceutical company, rather speaks broadly about the industry and how it helped fight these diseases. So it seems unusual for it to make it out that Kurzgesagt is propping up these companies when they don't mention any of these companies by name. We're going to jump ahead to about the 8-minute mark because, as said before, we're dealing with critiques of content right now.
In the videos on overpopulation, they show this amazing decline in global poverty, a trend which they attribute to economic growth.
As I've noted before, it's probably important for the sake of context to show what they actually said. That's because they don't actually say why poverty has decreased, just that it has.
The simple truth is that it's beneficial to you personally if people on the other side of the globe can live a good life. And we are getting there. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty has never been as low as today.
Hated One goes on to point out the first half of the graph is a bit speculative. He does this by pointing to an article by Jason Hickel.
But where is this data coming from? It's from Max Roser's graph at Our World in Data. But look at how the data points go all the way back to the early 19th century. None of these historical numbers are proven. Real data on poverty for the majority of the world didn't exist until 1981. Anything before that is a speculation.
I think this is a decently fair criticism of Kurzgesagt, as the quality of data does hit a sharp decline as soon as you get away from the 1980s. I say decent because the major point of Kurzgesagt's video is discussing overpopulation, and the problem the hated one has is with an 8-second clip. And if we were to use data after the 1980s, we could still show that poverty is still decreasing. Of course, hated one would argue against World in Data's poverty threshold of $1.90, and believes instead they should use $7.40 instead.
Lowest possible rate as an average from poverty lines of the poorest countries in the world. That's living below $1.90 a day. Scholars strongly disagree with this rate and suggest at least $7.40 a day. With the World Bank's rate, billions of people that are extremely poor according to their national poverty lines end up in lower middle income regions, which is what makes the graph looks like this instead of this if we use the $7.40 line, or this if we leave out China. So not a dramatic decline at all, but an increase actually, or a stagnation at best since 1981.
First of all, you can't claim at best it's stagnating if at best it's decreasing. And secondly, if you're going to compare the first graph to the latter graphs, make sure that they're in the same period of time, that the percentages line up so it's easier to tell the difference. And lastly, don't remove China from one of your graphs, as it makes it look like you're skewing your data hard, as you're removing one of the most populous countries in the world. The likely reason that the hated one chose to remove China in this graph is because this graph came from Jason Hickel. The reason that Hickel decided to remove China from his graph was over the claim that poverty was being decreased because of capitalism. This was mostly in response to Steven Pinker. And repeating myself again, whether China was removed and the threshold increased, poverty still dropped. Still, the hated one probably shouldn't have included this graph in their video, as Kurzgesagt never makes the claim that capitalism is fixing poverty in theirs. So we're kind of back to square one, where it still looks like you're skewing data, as we know the origins of the graph, just not why you put it in your video. For example, as I've pointed out before, these graphs that he's comparing have some stark differences to how they're being shown. Look at his total graph in comparison to Kurzgesagt's. We have the obvious difference in the period of time, but also only in Kurzgesagt's graph does it have the additional information of those above the poverty threshold. Consider it if we have this graph only showing those below the poverty threshold. This would have a massive impact on how we view this data. As time goes on, we only see the total number of those below the threshold increase. Only until we hit the 90s do we actually see the decrease in these numbers. It makes it seem like the issue with the historical data before the 1980s a moot point if we're talking about the total number of people, as we only see a decrease roughly around the 90s when the data is less limited. Then, of course, again, we're still not getting the whole picture, as we're only getting information about those below the threshold and not those above it. So what about the issue of poverty thresholds then? Which one is correct, $1.90 or $7.40? Well, I'd like to think that it's a fair criticism by the hated one, as those getting out of $1.90 doesn't tell us a whole lot of information. But on the other hand, if we're switching it to just $7.40, that also in a similar way isn't giving us the whole picture. If we want a full picture, why not just use multiple thresholds instead? World in Data has made an updated post which does include multiple thresholds, both above and below $7.40. And for clarity, I'm not saying either of these thresholds are wrong thresholds. I'm saying it's about having a better view of the issue. Right now I'm editing the video and I just noticed something. Now, it might have looked like I was eyeballing Hated One's graph when I claimed that it was decreasing rather than stagnating, but I was basing my information off of Hickel's graph, which is the same place that Hated One got his. Why bring this up? Well, as I was editing, I wanted to see if the data matches to a similar level to Hickel's graphs. So let's bring out both Hickel's and Hated One's graphs. Let's start with the graphs based on totals first. If we overlay them, we can see that it's almost a complete exact match. However, if we match up the percentage-based graphs, we can see that they don't exactly match. It's hard to say how this happened, as the graph from before was a perfect match, but for some reason, that's not the case now. It's likely that this was just a mistake. However, something that you wouldn't have noticed unless you looked at Hickel's graph and compared the two, is that unlike Hated One's graph, Hickel's graph goes to 2013. And again, this is a really weird thing. If this is a mistake, it's an unfortunate one at that, as if his data continued to follow the trend of Hickel's, it would still show that poverty had declined. This is really unfortunate, as of now it looks like he's butchering the data, as if he did include the data to 2013, the graph would have a much more obvious decline in comparison to the one that he shows in his video. So this whole criticism of Kurzgesagt's data isn't really a big problem for them, as none of the data they show is incorrect. And funnily enough, it's the Hated One that has messed up data, which is something we're going to see repeat when they start criticizing Kurzgesagt's climate responsibility video.
Look at the numbers on historical emissions from the video on who is responsible for climate change. Where are these numbers coming from? Our role in data, of course, but that's just one source that conveniently downplays the role of the developed countries in climate change. According to a paper from Lancet, funded by no one, the US is responsible not for 25% of emissions, but 40%. The EU is responsible for 29% instead of 22%. G8 emitted 85% of historical CO2, and the global north is accountable for 92% of excess carbon in the atmosphere.
We get to see two fundamental problems with the statements he's making. One, the data he's using as proof that Kurzgesagt is wrong isn't about historical emissions, rather they're discussing the responsibility for excess global CO2 emissions. So it's misleading to say that Kurzgesagt is wrong about their data when you're comparing something completely different. The other problem with this clip is that it doesn't capture the context. Hated One takes a 6-second clip with no audio of a 10-minute video and makes the claim that Kurzgesagt is downplaying the role of developed countries in carbon emissions. It's starting to look like he's trying to find anything wrong with Kurzgesagt's videos, whether or not there's actually anything there. As we can tell by his own criticisms, they're either lacking or they're just incorrect. For example, if we did give broader context to the Kurzgesagt video, we can see that Hated One's representation of it is very dishonest. Firstly, the video represents 3 general ways to measure responsibility: emissions today, historically, and per person. For example, Kurzgesagt could have just said for the per person data that the Middle East has the highest amount, but they didn't just stop there.
In 2017, Qatar had the highest emissions at a hefty 49 tons per person, followed by Trinidad and Tobago, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Brunei, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. But those are outliers.
And Hated One's statement that Kurzgesagt is downplaying the role of developed nations could not be even more wrong, because even in their own video, do they express that they don't think it's the fault of developing nations.
So the narrative that rapid climate change is really the responsibility of the developing world is hard to defend if facts matter to you.
The ending of the video makes the remark that even though wealthier nations are starting to have lower emissions today, they still should use their resources to help poorer nations so that they can skip the need for carbon and replace it with greener power generation.
Many Germans, for example, wonder how, if Germany only accounts for 2% of yearly emissions, it can have a meaningful impact on reducing emissions. The answer is simple. For one, the richest countries have the resources, highly educated workforces and technology to develop low-cost, low-carbon solutions and spread them around the world.
This is what I mean by context. It's easy to say that they're downplaying the role of developed countries when you show less than 1% of the actual content. Lastly, for our section of critiques dealing with content, let us go to the hated one's problems with innovations and investments. This discussion over innovations can be kind of split into 4 mini sections, as the innovation he talks about are carbon capture, nuclear energy, conventional farming, and alternative meat. Let's start with carbon capture first.
In the instance of carbon capture, Kurzgesagt pulled the numbers on cost straight from a Gates-funded magazine, who took the number from a Gates-funded private carbon capture facility. But that's the lowest estimate. In reality, it could be as much as twice as expensive today, and still at least twice as expensive as trees are right now, than carbon capture is projected to be in the most optimistic estimates, which won't be real until at least the next decade.
I think this is a strong critique of carbon capture. It has been heavily criticized as being a solution to climate change, and there is a minimal benefit from just a profit perspective. Carbon capture exists in the weird space, as some people believe that it would be better to invest money in green energy rather than in carbon capture, as there's fears that this would be a repeat of the idea called clean coal. I recommend watching Climate Town discussing the issue of clean coal, as they do give a good explanation of the issues surrounding carbon capture with coal. More positive discussions of carbon capture really only happen when discussing its use in the future, especially if we've reached carbon neutrality by then, as it's likely that we'll be using it then for removing residual emissions or achieving net negative emissions to reverse climate change. So we have a future solution for a problem that's later down the line that isn't useful to us as of now. Even Kurzgesagt recognizes that no one's actually benefiting from the use of carbon capture.
Meanwhile, very costly solutions for a far-off problem, like carbon capture, seem like they can wait, as technically nobody benefits from it right now.
This comes from the video Can You Fix Climate Change?, where they highlight that carbon capture as it stands now isn't feasible to implement. So I don't think it's a fair criticism by saying that they're downplaying the costs when they recognize that implementing it will bankrupt most industries. However, I still understand the worry of placing money into these types of devices, instead of investing purely into green energy. As of currently, there really is no benefit from them. But that doesn't remove the benefit we might have from these devices later down the line. But as soon as we step away from carbon capture, the criticism of other technologies hits a nosedive in quality. Because when we get to the other technologies that he has problems with, he just defaults to showing that they had linked our world and data, and that Bill Gates had invested in these technologies. Which makes all of this a bit weird, because the video he associates these technologies with are not sponsored by Bill Gates at all. This starts to feel conspiratorial, as it just needs to be that Bill Gates had invested in that technology shown in Kurzgesagt video, and for Kurzgesagt to use our world and data as a source for their content to become propaganda, even if it's not sponsored. The hated one tries to portray that they're only giving these industries a positive light because Bill Gates is funding these industries.
Kurzgesagt doesn't tell you which technologies Bill Gates is invested in and how positive messaging about them is advancing his positions. But Kurzgesagt did take the effort to mention exactly those technologies that Bill Gates and his billionaire friends are most invested in.
But as I've talked about before, he's leaving out a lot of context in those videos. In the nuclear energy video by Kurzgesagt, Hated One says that they only made this video because Bill Gates is making a nuclear reactor in Wyoming.
Their video on Do We Need Nuclear Energy to Stop Climate Change, Kurzgesagt prominently links to Our World in Data's pieces on nuclear energy. This video is not sponsored by Gates, but the billionaire is betting heavily on his new generation of nuclear reactors.
If they were being influenced by Bill Gates, why do they only say that it should be a stopgap measure? And even point out in the West, reactors are exceptionally expensive when compared to renewables.
Still, generally in the West, the current generation of nuclear power plants are more expensive to build and maintain than most fossil fuel alternatives.
And when we go to conventional farming, Hated1 says that Kurzgesagt is being heavily critical of organic farming.
Made videos heavily criticizing organic food. This is another topic of major investment from Gates, who thinks industrialized agriculture with pesticides and GMOs is the best approach to solving world hunger, which it hasn't solved so far. In all 4 cases where Kurzgesagt draws verdict on organic food, our worlding data is cited as reference. This video is also not sponsored by Gates.
But Kurzgesagt is not portraying them in a complete critical light, but is trying to dissuade negative assumptions about industrialized farming, and looking at the pros and cons with both, with its conclusion that they should have a combination of both types of farming.
Could be to stop seeing organic and conventional farming as irreconcilable. They both have pros and cons, and the best way to produce healthy food efficiently would be a combination of their best features.
Now, there are other weird things going on in that Hated1 clip. Like, GMOs are pointless now because they haven't solved world hunger. Now, that's certainly a combination of words, but there's also this weird statement.
In all 4 cases where Kurzgesagt draws verdict on organic food, our worlding data is cited as reference. This video is also not sponsored by Gates.
Why replay that? What's so weird about that? Well, I want to give you a second just to think or interpret what those words mean. This seems very trivial, but you'll understand where I'm going in just a second. My interpretation of what he just said is that there are only 4 cases where Kurzgesagt draws a verdict on organic food, and by the language that he uses, I assume that verdict is against organic. Then for each of these verdicts, they cite our world and data. Why play that little game? Well, now we're going to look at the context of things. We're going to look at Kurzgesagt's citations. When we look at the citations, we learn that there aren't 4 cases where Kurzgesagt draws a verdict on organic food, even if we were to assume the word verdict had negative connotations to it. Our world and data is used 4 times in the sources. It seems to me that Hated1 turned these 4 times into the only 4 verdicts. Putting back the citations on the screen, this obviously isn't accurate language, as Kurzgesagt in their citations give sources for nearly every statement they make, or in other words, a claim or a verdict. Looking at their sources right now, I've actually only stitched together 5 pages, though to be accurate, this isn't even the total amount, as there would need to be 6 more. I did this as I felt the amount that I placed on screen was enough to illustrate my point, that the claim of 4 verdicts is heavily exaggerating what Kurzgesagt actually did. Another thing we should talk about is those 4 verdicts. Hated1 does show all of these. However, if you don't take the time to read them, you might not find out that they're really not that harsh on organic food. The first says organic actually has far less pesticide residue than conventional food. The second makes note that for all food, it still should be fine to eat, as the pesticide residues that are left behind are still very minor. The third says that in some aspects, organic is more resource intensive than conventional. The final one makes note that both types of farming have their pros and cons, and that this conversation really shouldn't be considered black and white. And lastly, alternative meat.
The most generous billionaire is one of the earliest backers of alternative meats, owning major positions in vegan and meat-free protein companies. Kurzgesagt has made a series of videos on meat, all with a strong verdict on how meat is bad for you and the environment.
Strong verdict is a strong statement for how they portray meat. Starting with health, they provide a complex answer, with it giving multiple pros and cons depending on what types of meat you eat. With it promoting that fish and chicken are probably the best for you, red meat is mixed on the issue, and processed meat is probably the worst for you. When it comes to the environment, Kurzgesagt does portray our current consumption as harmful for the environment. However, I should remind you that none of these meat videos were sponsored. And while Hated1 seems to leave this out, he strangely does remember to mention it to his audience for the nuclear and organic farming videos, but only exceptionally briefly.
Pieces on nuclear energy. This video is not sponsored by Gates, but a reference. This video is also not sponsored by Gates.
These remarks are exceptionally brief, and he never comes back to the fact that these videos aren't sponsored, even though he's making these conspiratorial links. Strangely enough, he fails to mention this fact when he brings up the Kurzgesagt's meat videos. Not once does he mention that none of these videos are sponsored. This all comes back to my prior statement about the issue of context. A lot of the videos that Hated One is trying to portray as nefarious are simply more complex than that. If the reasoning was they were only making these videos because of Bill Gates, you would think they would portray these issues in a more heavily biased manner, and only portray the things that Bill Gates likes in only a good way, and portray the things that he doesn't like in only a bad way. But that doesn't happen in those videos. And to repeat myself again, all of this feels like a conspiratorial leap, especially since a lot of these videos aren't sponsored by Bill Gates. If the issue was the sponsored content, why criticize them for non-sponsored content? Bill Gates is certainly invested in solar energy. If Kurzgesagt makes a video about solar energy and then cites Our World in Data, does that make them propaganda? Let's say, hypothetically, as we know, Bill Gates is certainly invested in solar energy. If Kurzgesagt makes an unsponsored video about solar energy and then cites Our World in Data, does that mean that they're cooking more propaganda for billionaires? For me, I would have to say no. I've always thought propaganda had more of something to deal with misinformation, but I would like to hear your guys' thoughts on it down below. Continuing from the meat section of the video, Hated One does bring up the issue of conflict of interest, as for one of these videos, one person they had consulted with had worked in a meat-free business.
All of these videos were advised on by Hannah Ritchie, one of the key lieutenants at Our World in Data. During the production of at least one video, Ritchie was a business manager at a meat-free microprotein company. Whatever your take on meat is, these are conflicts of interest that should normally be disclosed by any serious research. But Kurzgesagt makes no effort to help you connect the dots. Kurzgesagt is terrible at disclosing their sponsors. I did a poll of my audience to see when they think channels should disclaim sponsorship. Most people would prefer before the video starts or during intro.
There are 3 takeaways that I have from that clip. First of all, I don't think anyone considers Kurzgesagt's videos serious academic research. They're 10-minute pop science videos on YouTube. They aren't publishing peer-reviewed studies. Second of all, if there is a conflict of interest, how does it show in the video? As in, Kurzgesagt made this mistake in their video because Hannah here had a conflict of interest, leading to an incorrect fact. Hated One doesn't do that in his video, probably because of our third takeaway. Understanding what we don't know. We don't actually know how much Hannah contributed to the creation of the video. Hated One himself just says that she had advised on it. What that actually means to the output of the video, we don't know. I know in the meat video he's talking about, they link 2 sources from Hannah, but only one is really relevant to the video, as the other is just for further reading. The relevant source in question is just used to prove that organic farming is worse than conventional farming when it comes to meat production. But as you can see, this doesn't really further a point about the conflict of interest when it comes to the meat-free company. Also, another reminder here, the meat videos that he's talking about, they're not sponsored. I've repeated this multiple times because his own video does not make this clear, which videos are sponsored versus which videos are not sponsored, which is a bit hypocritical for a guy complaining about lack of transparency. Sure, for some of the videos, he does give brief remarks that they're not sponsored, but when it comes to the meat videos, he completely leaves that fact out. Moving forward, we're going to skip a little ahead as the topic kind of repeats itself later on in the video, so we're just going to move there.
It is not enough to promise editorial independence because there are multiple ways sponsors can influence content behind the scenes. Kurzgesagt maintains their sponsors never have input on their scripts, but in practice, they routinely consult with researchers that come from sponsor-funded institutions or scientists directly on their sponsors' payroll.
Alright, this bothers me every time I see it. And what I mean by that is sometimes there are pieces of information that should probably get more coverage than they do. I understand there's a need to simplify things in videos because we simply can't put everything in it. But some things should probably be given more emphasis than others. And I can't think of anything that should be given more emphasis than Kurzgesagt's article describing their relationship with sponsorships. In Hated One's video, you're going to get less than 30 seconds of him talking about the article. However, even in these small amounts, there's still some shenanigans that are going on. For example, in the beginning, as we see, he brings up statements from Kurzgesagt that they claim they keep full editorial independence. In the latter half, before I play it again, I want you to think about the words Hated One is using, what they mean, how they relate to editorial independence, and/or input on their script.
But in practice, they routinely consult with researchers that come from sponsor-funded institutions or scientists directly on their sponsor's payroll.
What we have here is a classic false equivalence. The act of consulting does not equate to deciding what goes into a video. Understanding what words mean is always important. Sure, words can have multiple meanings, but I don't think the word consulting means that you lose editorial control. These are two different things. Another thing that Hated One portrays is the fact that they consulted with researchers who have worked with the sponsorship contradicts what they state in the article as some sort of reveal. Again, consulting does not mean losing editorial control. Besides that, though, they already admit this happens in that same article. They say they do work with experts provided by the sponsorship. The audience would probably have known that if you actually covered the article. Also, this may be a nitpick, but what they wrote in their article was that they always keep the last word. I bring that up because that's what should be on screen. They don't state this in the article, and this would be more clear to the audience if he actually covered the article for a little longer. And what I mean by that, sure, this is in the article, but they don't say it. That's why it's in quotes. This is a summarized brief quote from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Hated One doesn't even cite who's making this quote. It's just on the screen. I don't know why Hated One decided to put this into the video. Again, another weird mistake.
The two videos Kurzgesagt made with Max Roser were sponsored by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But Max Roser's Our World in Data received almost $5 million from Bill Gates, so what is exactly the degree of separation here?
This is a simple picture, but it's pretty representative of what's wrong with Hated One's video. It's hard to see, but there are simple things missing in this picture that, if they were added, would make this picture as a whole questionable. What may draw your eyes first in the picture is the amount of money that was given, but the real important thing here that should draw your eyes is the dates. 2.5 million from 2019 to 2021, 1.8 million in 2018, and 300,000 in 2016. The one key piece we're missing is the dates of the videos themselves. The video on the left is a selfish argument for making the world a better place. That came out in March 2018. The video on the right is Overpopulation, the Human Explosion Explained. That came out in December 2016. I think you can already guess the problem here. The 2.5 million, that shouldn't be on the screen right now. And the 1.8 million is a bit questionable in its inclusion. Without including the dates, Hated One is able to exaggerate the influence that Foundation has on Our World in Data, in at least relationship to Kurzgesagt's videos. And that's excluding what kind of influence that would even be. He simply makes Our World in Data into a mouthpiece of Bill Gates, but never shows the proof of this. It seems to me that he's trying to find anything to criticize Kurzgesagt over. And because of that, it leads to problems like this, where he fails to understand the broader issues with his own criticisms, such as time. We don't really need to look at the next few cuts because the argument basically repeats itself a few more times, but I did want to make one comment about the next cut.
In the video on vaccine side effects, Kurzgesagt lists 6 experts they consulted with, at least 4 of which are from Gates-funded institutions, and 1 scientist is an executive at the Gates Foundation. How is that not a sponsor commenting on their script?
First of all, the 54 on the screen doesn't actually list the 750 million that he claims. Note, if you try to research this yourself, you probably won't be able to find Hated One's links, as currently half of them are gone. I suspect where he really got this number was from this article here. The problem with this article is that it's about COVID. The problem with that is that the vaccine video came out in May 2019, months before COVID was even a thing. Again, it seems like we have run into the issue of time. Another thing to consider, besides time of course, is the group in question, the one who's receiving the funding, is called the Oxford Vaccine Group. Hated One tries to imply that if the group receives funding, they immediately stop being independent and are bound by Bill Gates' word. That's a leap in logic. But hypothetically, let's say the opposite. Does anything really change when we do this? They're a pro-vaccine group already. Their whole thing is researching vaccines. How does Bill Gates factor in? What does he change? None of this is explained because there isn't anything here to explain. We're going to pull back to the earlier parts of the video and go over the issue of Kurzgesagt being sponsored. I want to be careful here and really let you guys know that we're framing all of this when Hated One made his video. What did we know then? Not much of anything, and with the little that was available, of course, Hated One still managed to mess things up. First of all, Hated One tries to create some sort of false dichotomy as to prove that Kurzgesagt is a liar of sorts. This is done by showing that in a Medium article, they say that Gates Foundation has been so far their biggest supporter. Hated One compares this to another statement where they say they're almost entirely viewer-funded.
Sponsors. Here, Philip Detmer, the owner of the channel, admitted that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was their biggest supporter. So big, in fact, it helped transform Kurzgesagt into a powerhouse. But Philip Detmer also told us that Kurzgesagt is almost entirely viewer-funded. I wanted to know where the truth lies.
The problem is that both these statements can be true. Bill Gates can be your biggest supporter, but you can still receive the majority of your funds from viewers. These aren't opposites. But let's assume that these statements are opposites. They can still be true at the same time. Well, not at the same time. What I mean by that, if you could already notice a trend so far, is that I'm talking about the issue of time. The first quote comes from 2017. The second quote comes from 2022. That's a 5-year difference. Is it possible that their financial situation had changed over that period of time? This would allow for both statements to be true. This is just another weird mistake. Comparing two statements that have a 5-year difference between them just doesn't make sense. Hated One tries to prove that these statements are contradictory by showing how much they made from Patreon versus how much they made from sponsorships.
Were awarded $500,000 from the Gates Foundation and almost $6 million from Open Philanthropy. If they kept the same per video rate since the Gates grant, it could be estimated Kurzgesagt received at least $7 million from billionaire funds. This would be more money than Kurzgesagt received from their supporters on Patreon in the entire history of the channel. This made me realize that Kurzgesagt never was this small, independent, almost entirely viewer-funded channel.
When I say sponsors, I mean this in a limited manner, as the revenue discussion by Hated One is extremely limited, as into only 2 sources. This discussion does not include how much they get from ads, integrated or otherwise, or revenue from, well, their shop. This is likely because Hated One is working on only scraps of information and lacks the whole picture. I don't know if this is a good decision or not. I'm leaning towards no, but I'm going to assume the amount calculated for Patreon is correct. However, I will make a note that there's still some weird nonsense that's going on. Let's just double check that math. 570,000 divided by 8 is 71,250. I'm fine with you rounding up to 72,000, but you rounded up to 75,000. That's just another weird thing, especially when you have on screen the math. However, the more important weird thing that's just kind of glossed over is the $6 million from Open Philanthropy. That is about 85% of all of the funds. They have 2 videos, and their sponsorships are fairly recent, coming from December 2021 and March 2022. The problem is obvious. We have a single group here whose money outweighs the other sponsorships at least 5-fold, rendering their inclusion kinda pointless, which is weird for a video that's almost entirely dedicated to discussing the relationship between Kurzgesagt and Bill Gates, but mentions Open Philanthropy just 4 times. I can understand why people responded negatively to Hated One's video. It lacks evidence, there's jumps in reasoning, very little context, and it seems like Hated One pursued the creation of his video in complete bad faith. And the editing doesn't help, especially with the Jeffrey Epstein remarks.
If Kurzgesagt wants to maintain they are able to decouple the interests of their funding source from the content in their videos, does this mean that we'll soon get to see a cutely animated character of Bill Gates meeting up with Jeffrey Epstein at his private venues after he was convicted sex trafficker?
This is just cringe. There could have been a discussion about the issues of transparency in video creation, but this video isn't that.